Enclosing Identity. In this video, I will revisit a short talk that I gave at the 40th International Symposium on Economic Crime, held at Jesus College, Cambridge in September 2023. James Boyle, in his book The Public Domain, warned us of a world of rapacious state-aided privatization, including the conversion of identity into property. In it, he refers to the universal tension between the individual, the collective, and the state, particularly in respect of the so-called commons, namely those resources that a community recognizes as being freely accessible to all its members. Now, certain non-productive private, commercial and state properties coexist quite peacefully with the commons because of compromises worked out over time, usually because the commoners were taking value from what the owners thought worthless, or at least from which they could see no way of making a profit. Collecting firewood from fallen rotten trees on private land, or foraging for wild mushrooms, or rights of way, or village greens, or the English language, or alphabets, but not all fonts. They're all examples. However, whenever a new innovation creates proprietary opportunities, some previously common properties are enclosed. The scope of such enclosure will go way beyond mere intellectual or physical property, to strike at the very core of what is commonly considered personal identity. Until very recently, identity was outside of the property system altogether. However, that status is now under a concerted two-pronged attack. Every national government has always claimed the need to identify its citizens unambiguously for administrative and security purposes. Meanwhile, business, in its zeal to market its products, has resorted to profiling potential customers. Hence, a joint political and commercial imperative has arisen, which calls for an individual's physical and behavioral attributes to be scientifically sampled in such a way that the data can be used to identify that individual uniquely. Each sample is described and then represented in some externalized accessible form, a mix of textual, numerical, photographic and biometric data. These proxies for identity are stored in a database for subsequent identity management, all masquerading as that individual's private property. Such social, commercial and governmental databases have been slowly evolving. States have been collecting census data for millennia. Companies have come late to the fray. However, that evolution is now accelerating with the functionality delivered by information and communication technologies. This imperative is gradually removing the individual's common right to their own identity, even to ownership of their own body parts. John Moore of Seattle suffered from hairy cell leukemia, and in 1976 he had his spleen removed. The surgical team subsequently extracted T lymphocytes from the discarded organ and established a cell line for which they were granted a US patent, and from which they generated substantial income. Miller sued. He wanted his share of the booty. The court, however, concluded that no patient could exercise property rights over discarded body tissues. In giving his informed consent for the operation, Miller had allowed the researchers to enclose his body parts as their property and not his. Now, we tend to think of identity as being private, as belonging to us, that it is us. But we'd be wrong. The moment our identity is sampled and stored as data, it starts being treated as property and separated from us. It's crucial here to distinguish between identity and the way it's represented. So what is this stored identity? Well, not identity as such, rather a mere shadow representation of social, biometric and behavioral properties of each individual. A proxy that has been captured by whoever runs the database. Once enclosed, that proxy is turned into property that can be rented back to that individual, for example, as proof of identity. At the same time as being an individual's identity, as it's being enclosed, the data becomes accessible to anyone who can gain entry, legal or otherwise, to the database. It gets worse. If that database attains quasi-legal status, then individuals are allowed access to their personal property and or social benefits, etc., only with the express permission of the database. That is, each person, each real individual identity must submit itself to the database and prove itself similar enough to its proxy. Thus, the entry of an individual's data in the database now restricts that individual's freedom of action. Subsequently, various other forms of data on the individual are going to be appended to the database, not only for administrative convenience, but also for its income-generated potential for the owner of the database and any others who pay for access. Now, individuals volunteer more and more of their personal data to these databases for the promise of protection against so-called identity theft, only to find themselves at an increased risk. Now, this whole debate over identity is going to revolve around the notion of common property and the enclosure of the commons. And that includes access to natural resources, like are you allowed to breathe the air around you? Beware, ULEGS in London is just the start. An oxygen tax is coming. Problems arrive whenever social, economic or technological innovations disrupt the status quo of the value system. For then, a transfer of resources occurs from the commons to purely private or state ownership, what is generally known as enclosure. Why then do governments, even the democratic ones, support such enclosures, preferring to enrich a few individuals and companies rather than distribute the largesse among the whole population? Cynics like my ex-colleague, Professor Ken Minogue, would say it's all self-interest. The purpose of every government is to raise money to pay for government, a classic self-referential system. However, this is only partly the case. The creation of money itself is only made possible by institutionalizing, or that's another less obvious word for enclosing, for institutionalizing property. The commonly perceived notion of personal property is of things belonging to someone. However, this is a very naive view. Property is a government-sanctioned monopoly right over an enclosure, which is legally enforced through the courts. Government and government alone claim the right to signify ownership, but at a price. They will bestow rights of ownership on those groups that generate the maximum revenue to the state. Governments will seize, enclose, underproducing property and transfer it to those who promise productivity. Whatever the pretense, this has got nothing to do with what is popularly understood to be the moral justification of property owning. Ownership rights, therefore, are rented from the state to be paid for. That means some of these assets, or rather the government guaranteed rights over these assets, must be made productive, namely turned into property, monetized, and subsequently rented or sold. Either way, new debt is incurred somewhere in the economic system to keep that system going. Government can enclose these assets through the courts at any time by simply passing laws claiming ownership for itself, before possibly transferring it to others at a price. Now, however, the government cannot behave arbitrarily, because excessive seizure will limit the willingness of individuals to turn their assets into property, undermining the viability of the whole system. This is a harsh lesson that is eventually learned by every socialist state. Given the functionality of modern surveillance, the technology, property owners, aided by the state, have the capacity to widen their search patterns to check on all unlicensed use of enclosed property, making the process far more efficient and effective. Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and who knows what else are farming. Now, farming is another word for profiting from enclosing. Farming our every keystroke. Mobile phones report our exact positions so somebody can make a profit. State-run identity cards are next, after which there will be no escape into anonymity. Whatever the act of enclosure, deceitful justifications always play on the ambiguous positions of the commoner and the owner. Enclosing is being claimed to minimize loss and to maximize gain to those private owners in the society and to the population at large, all at the unfortunate but acceptable cost of reducing access to the commons and, of course, invading privacy. Consequently, our identities as property won't reside in the living flesh and blood of us, but in that one true, legally legitimated record in a data register. Each identity will be digitally enclosed, separated from the person, turned into property to be owned by others. All our so-called private property will, de facto, belong to the corresponding records in the register, and rights to that record will be no longer ours to decide. It is no longer belonging to us. Each of us has legal access to our property only with the permission of the owner of the register, and we must apply for access along with anyone else who's been given rights to access our assets. Our money will be transferred from our bank accounts whenever it is told to do so by the register, and the tax authorities will be first in line, and you won't be able to stop it happening. Paradoxically, we only agreed to join the register in order to protect ourselves from identity theft. But instead, we find ourselves victim of the ultimate identity theft, a total loss of control over our identities. Somebody other than us owns the proxy to our identity, and they reserve the right to turn it into property and to monetize it. Now, there's another word for this: slavery. Welcome to the brave new world, a world that has lost all sense of fair play, a world of rapacious state-aided privatization of enclosed identity. The ultimate identity theft. Thank you.